Muchas gracias, Diego. Gracias, Sebastián. Gracias, Enoch, por la participación. I switch to English now. We are delighted to have such a great panel. We have with us Oliver Strenkel from Fundación Getúlio Vargas from Brazil, Esti Peshin from IAI ELTA, Israel. She's already with us. And Ambassador Volker Stanzel from Germany. All of them are excellent presenters. We are delighted that you could join us. I am gonna briefly mention some of the main traits of your CVs, which are very long. Oliver works at the Getúlio Vargas, as I said, a very prestigious institution in Brazil. He's been writing extensively on the Global South and on political relations. He's actually working on a book on technological competition between the United States and China. So we deem his participation as key to the development of our ideas around 5G and geopolitics. So thank you, Oliver, for joining us. Esti, thank you for joining us, Esti. She is Vice President and heads the Division of Cybersecurity at ELTA Aerospace Industries in Israel. She is an expert. She's been working in technology for a long time. She's been a member of the Israeli Armed Forces for 11 years, where she was vice director of a unit of technology in the armed forces. And she works pro bono at the Knesset, where she advises in terms of technology to the specific commission at the Israeli parliament. Ambassador Volker Stanzel is a career diplomat. He is retired now. He has held posts in China as ambassador, in Japan as ambassador. He actually works as a senior member of the board at the Stiftung, correct me, my German ambassador, Stiftung für Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin. And in my view, it's amazing that he studied his PhD and his BA focusing in Japan and China, and he was able to be ambassador of both countries, representing, of course, Germany. He also was head of the political division of the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So welcome, the three of you. We will start with Oliver, if that's okay with you, Oliver. You have 12 minutes. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Alberto, for the invitation. I had prepared my presentation in Portuñol, but I'll happily switch to English. But for the debate, happy to do so in either Spanish or English, of course. I very much enjoyed the past debate that I've listened to, and I think that the nature of this discussion is really a reflection of the challenge that the international relations community faces as we're discussing 5G, because it is a far more technical debate than previous ones. It could be to some extent compared to perhaps nuclear proliferation issues, but one of the major difficulties, I think, that complicates both the academic but also the public debate is that we're discussing something that to both academics and policymakers is rather intangible. And in my experience in Brazil, that has been a major problem in advancing a discussion and focusing on technical issues rather than allowing the discussion to be profoundly politicized. And I think, speaking about the technical aspects, it becomes clear that we're seeing a discussion that is far more nuanced than, the US versus China. But if you just survey the public debate that's going on in Brazil, for example, it becomes clear that it pretty much looks like a discussion about, are we with the US or are we with China? And I think that is something that will be a major challenge for all those who are working on these issues, is to make sure that policymakers and civil society are as involved as possible without falling back to a simplistic way of thinking about these issues. In my research, I am particularly looking at how third countries are reacting to this new scenario and are interpreting both the current bilateral relationship between the United States and China, which of course is going through perhaps the worst crisis over the past decades, with a deterioration that I think does not depend on President Trump. I think that there's been a steady decline over the past years that began during the Obama administration. And I think it's interesting to track how the so-called pander huggers kind of lost influence in Washington, largely because the US view of China has historically been based on a misperception when it comes to the US capacity to transform China. It's quite interesting that this began with George Marshall, who sought to mediate between the communists and the nationalists. It was like that with Nixon, Clinton, even Obama. So the idea was always to invite China into the international system and to thus liberalize China's economic system and political system above all, which of course didn't happen. So I think there's a profound sense of frustration which goes beyond Trump. And I think an initial point to make here is this is a really important discussion because it will not be impacted so much on who gets elected on November 3rd or in the weeks after. I think this is a structural issue, and the discussion in Brazil, unfortunately, continues to be quite superficial. It has begun now, at least. I think that's the first step. I think it's far more advanced in Europe, in countries like France and Germany and the UK. It has reached the center of foreign policy debates, and I think it will remain there for a considerable amount of time, because again, I expect the Biden administration to have a fairly similar stance on China and on particularly attempts to continue to incentivize decoupling, even though decoupling has been very slow. And that, of course, makes, I think, the continuous comparison between the Cold War in the 20th century and our sort of tech Cold War, or whatever we may call it, difficult, because despite Trump pressure against US companies to disengage from the Chinese market, the number of companies that has actually done so is fairly limited. And even Apple, which has made a much commented move to produce partly in India, has only shifted really a relatively small part to India. So the dependence it continues to be a reality. And that gives some hope, I think, to third countries, because the choice is that Brazil is facing now when it comes to Huawei is a choice that deep down Brazil doesn't want to make, right? It's a profoundly uncomfortable choice. Brazil wants to have strategic autonomy. So the country is shaped by its reluctance to side with one side. In that sense, Bolsonaro is an historical aberration. It's very unusual for a Brazilian president to seek to align so strongly with one country. But I would say that Brazil is perhaps an interesting case study, because it's the country that I think has handled this discussion in the worst possible way by internalizing the contest, where if you're sort of part of the ideological pro-US faction of the Bolsonaro government, you are defending the exclusion of Huawei from the bidding process, which is set to take place early next year. Whereas if you're sort of against the president, then it's, of course, you want to have Huawei in the boat because you believe that continued Chinese influence in Latin America is a tool to protect yourself from US influence in Latin America. And I think that is, of course, an extreme politicization of this issue, which is in part the result of US attempts to elevate the discussion of 5G to a strategic level. Whereas the Chinese communication in Latin America has been very much focused on technical aspects, has been focused on jobs, on cost, and that has been much more, has been working much better to when you talk to sort of tech, experts who focus on telecommunication, public sector bureaucrats, governors, the minister of the economy, his key advisors, the telecommunications agency, and that makes for a difficult discussion that we're having right now in Brazil. And the ideal sort of, I spoke to a Bolsonaro advisor, and he said, the best thing would be for us to delay the decision so much that by the time we take it, nobody pays attention to us, which is, of course, not possible. Brazil is the 6th most populous country in the world. It's a major prize. And the pressure on Brazil from China and the United States has been really tremendous. When Bolsonaro traveled to Washington in February last year, 5G was the first thing that Trump brought up with Bolsonaro. It's key because it's part of an attempt by the United States, of course, to reduce Chinese influence in Latin America. And it's for Bolsonaro, who has not been able to deliver much to the United States, it's seen as a key issue. And he's personally interested in banning Huawei as a proof to the US that Brazil is a reliable ally. And that, of course, unnerves the entire business elites and the community. Brazilian agro-business is terrified because, as you all know, Brazil is dependent on China. Its exports to China are twice as large as those to the United States. So the country, I think, again, I don't want to speak here only about Brazil, but I think it's an interesting case of how there's been a tremendous difficulty to think strategically and long-term in a country where the political system incentivizes decision makers to make short-term decisions that have an immediate impact, right? So basically, one side of the government doesn't want to ban Huawei because it doesn't want to have an immediate negative impact on its exports to China, whereas Trump doesn't want to be seen as caving into Chinese pressure. He wants to be seen as a reliable ally to the United States, which is seen as politically important to him because his followers are also Trump supporters. I think what is missing in this discussion, of course, is a much broader debate, which unfortunately doesn't take place as a region. So Latin America doesn't have a regional discussion, and this is why I think events like these are so important. It's the number of people studying these issues, both within and outside of government in Brazil, is small, and the context that exists between other Latin American countries are very limited. And my sense sometimes is that the indecision that Brazil is facing at this stage between what to do about Huawei is not as visible in other Latin American countries. So I think that in general the region could benefit a lot from promoting this discussion. I think what's also missing from this debate in Brazil is an analysis of really how much China has invested in occupying key positions in multilateral fora. We've just heard about the technological standards. I don't want to get into that, but I think that's really a really crucial issue here. That UN Telecommunications Agency now is led by a Chinese who's very open about being pro-China and pro-Huawei, and I think that the U.S. retreat from these multilateral fora has been a boon, has been a gift to China to be seen as a more sort of a pro-multilateral force. And I think that is one thing that could change under Biden, is that the U.S., by focusing more on and expanding its presence in multilateral fora, I think China would have a bit more difficult time than over the past 4 years, which basically has been easy for China to gather more support, particularly because the Trump's tough position vis-a-vis Europe has led Europe to be in a situation where it isn't really sure what to do about this, and where the United States is seen as less reliable than perhaps even China. Even the public opinion in several European countries now suggests that, for example, the German population is less trustful, trusts Trump less than Xi Jinping. And I think that, of course, also needs to be taken into consideration as these governments make their decisions. Now, that I expect to change in a Biden administration, which I think has a greater capacity to reinvigorate and protect the transatlantic relationship. I know that, just to finish, I know that it's too simplistic to speak about this as a U.S. versus China choice, but I do think that the risks towards a different kind of globalization that is shaped by technological spheres of influence that are not necessarily compatible with each other, it's a real risk that I think emerging markets, I mean, it's considering Brazil's trajectory is not really an adequate term, but it's important to consider the fact that companies increasingly are looking for geopolitical resilience. So basically no longer focusing alone on eliminating inefficiencies in their global supply chains, but also articulating separate supply chains that prepare these countries to continue operating, these companies to continue operating, even if, for example, a trade war between the United States and China deepens. And in general, I think that's not something that has been adequately considered of how to react in such a situation. And I think there's a very limited discussion on how third countries could actually work together in order to avoid such an outcome. It's a discussion that's been tremendously dominated by analyses of what's going on in Beijing and what's going on in Washington. But I think I always encourage people, or I always try to think harder about the role that third countries have in this situation and how they could articulate a narrative that perhaps questions the inevitability of a new type of globalization, which is much less efficient because it's much more dominated by geopolitics. Alberto, I think I'll pass the word back to you and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Oliver. It was great. Esti, if you are there, thank you again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Voy a empezar en español. Buenos días en Argentina y buenas tardes aquí en Israel. Soy la directora general de la División Cibernética de IAI, Israel Aerospace Industries. Estoy honorado de participar en este seminario. Muchas gracias a Alberto para la invitación. Disculpe mi español, por favor. Está en un nivel de principiantes. Sin embargo, estudiamos español para un mediodía cada semana y espero que la próxima vez que hablaré aquí, mi español sea mejor. Con esto, estimados participantes, pasaré al inglés durante el resto de mi presentación sobre la ciberseguridad en la era 5G. And with that, I'm going to share a screen, if that's okay with everyone. And let's go. I hope you can see my presentation. Alberto, yes? Okay,
yeah,
perfect.
excellent. Thank you. It's already on screen.
Okay, so I really hope that next time I speak here, I'm going to do this in Spanish, but now I'm going to do this in English, and I'm going to speak about another aspect of 5G. It relates to the political aspect. It relates to the excellent presentations that I heard earlier in this panel and in the previous one. I'm going to speak about cybersecurity strategy in the 5G era. So first, I think you would all agree with me that the number of cybersecurity events, cybersecurity attacks has been constantly growing. I won't get into each and every one of these examples that you can see on the screen, but I will share with you one insight. And this insight is that more and more critical infrastructures are being targeted. Now, cyber is a strategic threat, and today we see 5 aspects of this threat. Number one, we see state and superpower involvement, and this relates to the previous presenter, to Mr. Oliver. We see an increase in cybercrime, even in countries where the crime level is low. We see more and more cyber attacks on critical infrastructures, large-scale industrial espionage, which again relate to critical infrastructures. We see CNI, which is influence campaigns, mainly to influence outcomes related to public opinions, for example, outcomes of elections in certain countries. And we see the proliferation of malware. This basically means that an attacker that would like to gain access to malware can do this relatively easily. Distilling this into 4 strategic trends, we're seeing a weaponization of the cyber domain. Cyber is becoming a weapon. Nation states are using cyber in order to exert power. We see an issue with attribution and accountability, and this basically means that if someone were to attack me, I wouldn't necessarily know who it was. And if I don't know who it was, I cannot retaliate. If I cannot retaliate, there is no deterrence. The person who would want to attack me will not be deterred to attack me. He will not pay a price of attacking me. And we're seeing a growing skills gap. There's an opportunity here as well. There are more and more cyber attackers and not enough cyber defenders. There's an opportunity here because the nation states that invest in creating cyber experts and establishing, for example, cyber academies can actually move the needle on their GDP. So this is something that has an economical impact on the good guy side, but it's also a very important issue on the bad guy side, because the skill gap means that it is easier to attack us. And finally, the bad guys are eyeing new technologies. They're eyeing the cloud, they're eyeing IoT, they're eyeing 5G, and they are moving faster than us. The attackers are moving faster than the defenders. When we are looking at critical infrastructures, we see several threats, several cyber threats. Number one, most critical infrastructures have an operational network or an OT network and have an IT network, which is the administration network. These networks are connected. Even if a critical infrastructures would tell you that they aren't connecting their networks, they probably don't know. They are connected. And this connection poses a severe threat to the networks. Systems are becoming end of life, and when they are end of life, there is no investment in their security. Even in systems that are not end of life, we need to update them. There are software updates. So when we update, we connect the systems to the internet, and then this is a path through which cyber attacks can go. Supply chain is a major challenge. We are relying on a lot of software and hardware from third-party vendors, which may or may not be secure enough. So keeping our system secure requires us to keep our ecosystem secure, and this is actually a huge challenge. In my opinion, this is the #1 challenge. There are always physical threats. Someone can gain access to a computer. Someone can gain access to a database and attack from there. And finally, today in most critical infrastructures, there's a remote access element. Basically, it means that the vendor, for example, of a turbine can gain access to the turbine to help monitor it. And when he does, It means that there is a connection through which a cyber attack can pass. So these are the main cyber threats of critical infrastructures. Let's speak a little bit about 5G. So I'm not going to go very, very deeply into this because previous speakers covered it very, very well. But 5G is faster, has higher bandwidth, has lower latency, requires less energy, has higher reliability, and supports more devices. Bottom line, 5G is something that we all want to transition to. But 5G also has inherent cyber threats, and I'm going to mention 5 of them. Number one, unlike 4G, 5G doesn't have centralized security. Okay? The main essence of 5G is that due to the increased bandwidth, things can talk to things. This is, for example, extremely important when we are talking about autonomous cars. So when there will be autonomous cars, they will not have to communicate to each other through a central entity, but cars on the same highway will be able to speak to one another to create a local situational awareness. But this means that each car will have to protect itself. And this is crucial because it means that the security of the entire network relies on the security of each and every element within the network. This is something we haven't encountered in the past. The bandwidth, which is a good thing, is going to overload the current security tools. So we will need to change the paradigm of cybersecurity for 5G. Most IoT devices do not have built-in security, and this relates to the previous item of decentralized security. So we will have to change also our IoT devices. There's an inherent lack of encryption. This will probably be sorted out as the network progresses. And today, IoT is used for botnet attacks. Botnet attacks are attacks where you use devices or computers to send information to a central hub in order to crash that hub. Quite a few of these attacks happened, including a very serious attack against a major DNS provider around the world. When there will be more devices, when there will be higher bandwidth, these attacks will become more and more severe. I want to give you an example. So I spoke about autonomous cars, but I want to give you another example of where 5G can create a severe situation. And this is an example from aviation. So in aviation, there is a term that is called gate link. The idea is basically that when an airplane, a modern airplane, reaches the gate, they're able to download information from the airplane directly to a connection in the gate, ergo the term gate link, and to upload information. Now, look at this scenario. The airplane is a thing. It connects to an airport network at a gate. Usually it's a different gate every time. Once the airplane leaves the gate, a new airplane connects to the gate. The airplanes are next to one another, so each airplane has access to the ones next to him, and the gate has access to the airplane. This is a situation that we do not know in cybersecurity, where the network is extremely dynamic. The network around us is constantly changing. We are constantly communicating with new things. And this is going to be the main challenge of cybersecurity in the 5G era. I'm going to mention very, very briefly something that I think is extremely important, and this is how the coronavirus is changing the way we do business. So guys, I'm sitting now in Jerusalem, Israel, and I'm speaking in Argentina. It's amazing. It didn't happen so much before the coronavirus era. And we are seeing a major change in the way we are doing business. So we are seeing a very large adoption of work from home technologies. We're seeing heightened activities on customer-facing networks, greater use of online services, for example, the one we are using now. And we are seeing also use of personal devices and email for work purposes. Now, lo and behold, the bad guys, the adversaries, are aware of these opportunities and they're abusing the situation for their advantage. So taking into account the emerging 5G on one hand, which is an inherent cybersecurity challenges, and on the other hand, the fact that the way we are doing business is changing, well, this requires a huge paradigm change in how cybersecurity companies like ourselves are going to address these challenges. So how are we going to address these challenges? Well, first and foremost, we need to understand, and Oliver spoke about this very, very clearly, that when we are talking about 5G, we're talking about a national issue. In essence, it can also be a regional issue and to some extent a global issue. But let's speak about a national issue. When we're talking about national grade cybersecurity challenges, we need national grade cybersecurity solutions. This cannot be sorted out at the level of each company or each person or each critical infrastructure. This needs to have a holistic national solution. And this solution comprises of 5 elements. Number 1, state-of-the-art technology, methodology on how to use the technology, constant innovation, because technology doesn't stop here, it's going to continue evolving. So our solutions must evolve with the technology and with the new threats that come with it. Collaboration is crucial. We need to collaborate both on the national and on the international level. I do agree that these types of forums are extremely important. This is why I was so happy to accept the invitation of Alberto to join. And finally, capacity buildup. Capacity buildup means awareness, means training, means cyber hygiene, means ensuring that the population is aware of cyber threats. This is crucial because the weakest link is always the human. Now, we must understand that there is a trade-off between cybersecurity and business continuity. In a perfect world where there were no cyber threats, we would have perfect business continuity. Cybersecurity impairs business continuity, but it is crucial because if we don't deploy cybersecurity controls, then eventually our networks will crash. Eventually we won't control our data. Eventually we may become a botnet and harm other networks. Now, briefly about IAI, just one aspect of IAI. We are the leaders of Israel's Cyber Companies Consortium, ICCC, and Israel's Aviation Cyber Companies Consortium. This is to highlight to you the work we are doing in terms of collaboration. The Israeli Cyber Companies Consortium comprises of 13 companies, and the Israeli Aviation Cyber Companies Consortium comprises of 8 companies today. And together we are offering end-to-end solutions at the national level. When we're talking about cybersecurity at the national level, we are talking about 6 crucial elements. Number 1, awareness. Everyone should be aware of cyber threats. This is going to be extremely more important in the 5G era. We need to understand the environment we are operating in. We need a baseline security. Every company, every critical infrastructure, every government office needs to have at least a minimal level of cybersecurity. This baseline security should be determined at the national level, should be mandated at the national level, and should be implemented at the company or the critical infrastructure level. We need solutions for remote work and services. The world has changed. We will continue to a certain extent working online, working remotely. So we need better solutions for this. We need predictive analytics because cyber threats are becoming more and more subtle. So we need to be able to detect them even when they are very, very low key. We need to protect our critical infrastructures, and we need the procedures and playbooks to be able to handle a cyber attack as and when it happens. So if I distill this into 3 kind of buzzwords, number 1, we need situational awareness, basically understanding at the national level if a cyber attack is happening. We need advanced incident response capabilities. If a cyber attack has happened, how do we address it? How do we handle it? And finally, we need information sharing. We need to share information about cyber attacks with like-minded countries, with like-minded organizations, because if a certain country is attacked and shares information about this attack, other countries will be able to mitigate this attack. This is extremely more important in the 5G era. Finally, the takeaways or the summary. So in order to be able to protect a nation state in the 5G era, we need an ecosystem solution. We need advanced cyber threats. We need to understand that our critical infrastructures include built-in vulnerabilities, and we need a collaborative approach, information sharing, and advanced capabilities. Finally, we need to strike a balance between cybersecurity and business continuity. We need to determine the balance point, and we need to adhere to it very, very strongly. With this, ladies and gentlemen, I conclude my remarks. Thank you. Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you very much for that great presentation, Esti. Volker, it's now your turn. Welcome once again. Thank you for joining us, and please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Alberto. Thank you, everybody, for the invitation. It's an enticing subject, and because you were aware that I don't understand Spanish sufficiently to know what has been talked about, you gave me a subject which is closer to my field of work, which is that of a practitioner of diplomatic politics, not of a technical expert. So the end of globalization, question mark, this is a tempting subject. I thought the very first moment that you wrote to me about it, globalization representing, if you want to put it broadly, the human condition as such, representing our very selves, much more than we think. And maybe that is at the root of the problem of many of the things that we are discussing presently, and maybe you also have discussed at this conference. Now, that's why I'll take a rather general approach instead of discussing China and the US, which we may do later in our discussion. I'd like to look at not specifically the political or technical aspects, but three very general aspects. And the first one is speed. Ever since Karl Marx in 1848, or even ever since the Silk Road, or even ever since we had Stone Age trade routes, the global expansion of the exchange of goods and of ideas, that's globalization to me, was also a function of the speed with which it occurred. The faster such an exchange, the more thorough its impact, because of the availability, greater availability of things and of knowledge, which enabled a more intense processing, enabled more intense inventing of new things, or to think new ideas, and thus producing both new things and to think new ideas. And thus enlarging, I think, the fields of material diversity and the diversity of thought, which again enriched and changed the human condition. Now, that doesn't happen at the same speed all over the millennia, and it doesn't happen in a straight line either. There are physical barriers that stand in the way. So steamships only travel that fast, and they carry only that much. And humans can only process in their minds what is at their hands. And at a given point, technical possibilities are exhausted. And that is the moment when globalization slows down. Now, since the end of the Second World War, we humans have increased the speed of that kind of exchange. And technology has sped up globalization processes even more. And I assume there are experts here that know that there is a mathematical formula that explains that increase in speed. But today, the engine seems to be sputtering. So that is why the question is legitimate. Is there an end to globalization? I would say, so far, it's a slowdown. It's a pause, but it can become an end as well. So the question is now what? Now, the second aspect is the economic one. Globalization basically always has brought an increase in prosperity. Again, since the end of the Second World War, and especially since the digital revolution, which changed the nature of global interaction, humans have experienced new levels of prosperity unimaginable ever before. Poverty eradicated to an enormously high degree, with exceptions, and this are the famous bottom billion, of course. That is a prosperity which has enabled development of new levels of knowledge for much broader parts of populations, and has given different qualities, better qualities, to our lives. Now, a new stage in that process today is the extensive differentiation of economic development. And that affects intensely countries and parts of populations in our industrialized countries as well as elsewhere in the world. And that has led to the appearance of new pockets of poverty nobody thought about in the past. A relative poverty market, not like Oliver Twist, but think of the opioid phenomenon in the United States. Now, there are terms describing those phenomena in the industrialized world, the Rust Belt, or in Great Britain, the Midlands. But of course, you know that they exist in many, many countries, even in Northeast China, where the steel workers lose jobs and there are no new jobs for millions of them. The long period of economic growth owed to globalization, which we all have experienced, has in fact created attitudes of entitlement throughout the world. People at whichever level feel they have an almost natural claim, a birthright, to more prosperity on whichever level they live at. No wonder then that politicians, be it Trump or be it Bolsonaro or be it Putin or Xi Jinping, play to those sentiments and to those claims. And that obviously is the phenomenon of populism. And in turn, that leads quite naturally to what we all observe today, which is protectionism. Now, protectionism is easy to say, and we all know the phenomenon from the past, but today it has an extremely aggressive side to it, because countries ask themselves how to get hold of the prerequisites for progress in emerging technologies which promise enormous riches. So we're talking about 5G, obviously, and this is AI and quantum computing and autonomous driving, etc. And the components of those technologies, physical ones like semiconductors or their know-how, move between only very few countries. So some in the European Union, the United States, China, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, of course, that is all. Now, none of these has achieved strategic autonomy in these technologies or self-sufficiency. So far, these countries are all interdependent, depending on value chains, on division of labor, on cooperation. Now, because so many riches are potentially involved in this technology, the question is how to ensure it works, how to ensure to be self-sufficient to a degree, to acquire more of them, or to deny it to others. And this has a great potential for a great many conflicts in the future, I think. So, in a way, I think this new kind of protectionism is the very enemy of globalization. And so also for reasons of the specific character of economic development, globalization again pauses. And again, the question is, what now? And my third aspect is geopolitics. Again, we observe a phenomenon of disintegration, of dissolution, even of the structures of the globalization and of the order that we have managed to develop since the end of World War II. That is the multilateralist world order. So to say, the WTO order in trade matters, also on the political level. It goes beyond trade. It means that we act in our system of international relations according to rules which we've given ourselves. There is obviously always the temptation to bend these rules in our favor. And I gave examples, a major example for that, I think, before. And this temptation increases in times when economic hardship threatens us, in times of protectionism. Thus, if one actor possesses means of providing or denying others what they need to remain a full-fledged partner in the game of globalization, maybe they will use it in order to gain advantages over others. Again, 5G is a case in point that you have discussed, I think, extensively. It is an instrument of power politics, and it seems to give globalization also a pause. So my concluding question again is, what now? And the United Nations, represents civilizational progress because they enabled the peoples of the world to interact more or less peacefully according to those self-given rules I mentioned. But now these rules are often undermined and threatened to be undermined even more. And with globalization pausing, threatening disintegration of the world order, we see that without a world government, there's no way to reinforce what we've become used of in the terms of our international order. But first of all, do we want a world government? I leave that discussion aside. But even if we wanted one, how do we get one? We have the United Nations because of 2 world wars. And we did have the Westphalian international system of 1648 because of 30 years of war. We don't wish for another war in order to improve the international order as it is. So the question in the end is, are we able to initiate processes that resolve the problem globalization faces today, which gives it pause? Have we made further civilizational progress since 1945, which enables us to sit down and think? Think, that's what the so-called T20 are for. Think, however, I think is not enough. Whoever listened to Plato, whoever listened to Kant or Confucius, many did, but who implemented what they had thought about? Thinking is one thing, it's relatively easy. You're all thinkers. But we need also to think about how to translate what we arrive at when we think into practical politics. I said, you asked a practitioner to speak to you, and that's what I tried to do. Thank you very much.